Welcome to the eternal life of the Black Dahlia, the story of the most famous unsolved murder in Los Angeles and the woman behind the myth who never dreamed of infamy. This is H. Allegra Lansing. In episode 12, Not Your Murder Muse, we confront the culture that turned Elizabeth Short into an icon of Hollywood and horror, and ask what it means when tragedy becomes entertainment. Elizabeth Short didn't live to see the kind of fame she was destined for, the fame that devours, the fame that rewrites. When she died, she was just another hopeful girl in a city built on dreams deferred, a woman whose name would have vanished into the smog of post-war Los Angeles. Instead, her death became her debut. The mutilation of her body, its cruelty, its strangeness, transformed her into something else. A myth, a mystery, a movie still waiting for a final act of redemption. By the time her name reached the front pages, it wasn't Elizabeth Short anymore. It was the Black Dahlia. The woman vanished. The invention took her place. And once the world saw that she could sell, newspapers, books, ticket stubs, tattoos, t-shirts, she was never allowed to rest again. Every decade since has remade her. She's been a pulp heroine, a Hollywood tease, a noir pinup, a ghost, a crime scene, a cautionary tale. She's been written, rewritten, reenacted, recut, and reskinned. She's the subject of bus tours, where Los Angeles tourists can trace the places where the Black Dahlia walked the city until fate claimed her. And each time, the same paradox repeats. The more we say her moniker, the less of her remains. We think we've been obsessed with her death, but the truth is we've been obsessed with her body. It's as though we've kept her on display in our collective imagination, a funhouse mannequin that we keep dressing up and stabbing again. Not out of malice, but out of morbid love, a ritual, a fascination disguised as remembrance. Because she was beautiful, because she was mysterious, because she looked like the kind of woman 1,000 stories could be told about. But she wasn't a story. She was a person, a daughter, a sister, a friend, a girl who never really made it into womanhood. And if this episode feels more like an exorcism than an investigation, that's because it is. We're not just telling how Elizabeth Short became famous. We're asking why we needed her to be. The first myth makers were not novelists or filmmakers. They were newspapermen. In January 1947, Los Angeles was addicted to crime the way the city is now addicted to celebrity. The two, in fact, were one and the same. The Los Angeles Examiner, the Herald Express, and the Daily News were in a circulation war, and murder was money. When Elizabeth Short's body was found, they didn't just report it, they sold it. And from that first edition, she wasn't human anymore. She was product. The headlines told readers who she was supposed to be before anyone had identified her. Dark-haired beauty slain. Black Dahlia found nude, cut in half. Vicious sex fiend at large. They described her as a party girl, a drifter, a coquette. They invented occupations for her. Actress, model, call girl. They invented lovers, too. A trail of men, mystery boyfriends, jealous suitors. Each line another nail in the coffin of Elizabeth's reputation. The truth was simpler, smaller, and sadder. She'd been unemployed, often hungry, often scared. She'd been living on couches, sometimes pretending she had more than she did. But the papers didn't want a frightened girl. They wanted a femme fatale. so they made her one. The name Black Dahlia didn't originate with the Examiner's crime desk, but they amplified it until it became a brand. Local drugstore patrons in Long Beach had supposedly called her that. A dark joke, a nod to the Blue Dahlia, the noir film starring Alan Ladd and Veronica Lake that had been released the previous spring. But with the name the press discovered, the woman at the counter who wore white sweaters, flowers in her hair, became shorthand for danger and desire. By the time her autopsy report was complete, the branding campaign was too. The Black Dahlia was no longer a victim. She was a symbol of fallen women, of Hollywood corruption, of American fear. And the photos sealed the deal. The crime scene images, her bisected body, her vacant eyes, her mutilated mouth, circulated like pornography for the morbid. Reporters bribed morgue attendants. Photographers slipped copies under the table. Editors justified it as public interest. But it wasn't journalism, it was spectacle. They couldn't publish the nudity, so they published the illusion of it. The white flesh, the half-glimpsed wounds, the promise of forbidden knowledge. Each cropped photo titillated and terrorized in equal measure. Hollywood noticed. Producers, screenwriters, pulp authors, they saw what the Examiner had done and realized they could do the same, but more artfully. They turned Elizabeth's death into a noir archetype, the mysterious woman whose beauty destroys her, the siren whose sin is existing in a world that profits from her body. By 1949, she was already a legend. By 1955, she was a ghost story. By 1960, she was an aesthetic. Because America loves a dead girl it can decorate. It's safer than loving a live one. When Hollywood first met the Black Dahlia, it did not see Elizabeth Short. It saw a story that already knew how to sell itself. In the weeks after her murder, newspapers had already done much of the work that pulp fiction would later inherit. The nickname came first, then the photographs, then the suggestion, repeated often enough to become accepted fact, that Elizabeth had lived some secret, dangerous life. By the time the investigation began to stall, the outlines of a new kind of character had already been created. Not a victim, but a figure. Beautiful, doomed, available for interpretation. Pulp fiction moved quickly to claim her. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, crime magazines and paperback publishers were thriving on America's appetite for sensational violence. Cheap novels filled newsstands, their covers painted in lurid colors. Women sprawled across beds, men looming in shadow, blood rendered as something almost decorative. These stories rarely used Elizabeth Short's real name, but the inspiration was unmistakable. A murdered brunette in Los Angeles. A body discovered in a vacant lot. A woman whose sexuality was implied, exaggerated, or invented outright to justify the violence done to her. The pulp version of Elizabeth Short became a type rather than a person. She was the drifter who wanted too much, the small-town girl corrupted by Hollywood, the temptress punished for ambition, or, just as often, the innocent destroyed by a decadent city. The details shifted depending on the author's needs, but the outcome never changed. The woman existed only to die. This was not unusual for the genre. Pulp fiction depended on female suffering as narrative fuel. But the Dahlia case offered something uniquely useful. It was unsolved. Without a known killer, writers could invent motives freely. The crime became elastic, endlessly adaptable. Every author could impose their own explanation, their own morality, their own fantasy of what had happened in those missing days. And with each retelling, Elizabeth herself disappeared further. By the 1960s and early 1970s, as noir fiction experienced a revival, the Black Dahlia had already hardened into myth. She appeared in novels as shorthand, a symbol of Los Angeles itself, beauty and decay, promise and corruption, the city that devoured dreamers. Writers no longer needed to explain her story. Readers already knew it, or thought they did. Then, in 1987, James Ellroy published The Black Dahlia, and the mythology shifted again. Ellroy's novel is widely regarded as one of the defining works of modern noir. It is brutal, obsessive, and hypnotic, but it is also deeply personal. Ellroy's own mother, Geneva Hilliker Ellroy, had been murdered when he was 10 years old. Her killer was never identified. That unresolved trauma sits beneath every page of the book. Elizabeth Short becomes less a historical figure than a vessel, a way for Ellroy to explore grief, rage, and the psychic wound left by an unsolved crime. In Ellroy's hands, the Dahlia becomes mythic. She is unknowable, eroticized, fragmented. The detectives who pursue her killer become consumed by her image, projecting longing and guilt onto a woman they never knew. The novel understands something uncomfortable about the case, that the obsession with Elizabeth often says more about the observer than the observed. And that is both the brilliance and the danger of Ellroy's work. Because while the novel critiques obsession, it also reinforces it. Readers fall into the same trap as the characters. The corpse becomes central. The woman becomes secondary. Elizabeth Short is transformed into an idea, a mystery to be solved, a fantasy to be interpreted, a wound that gives the story its emotional charge. Ellroy wasn't the first to do this. He simply did it better. By the time his novel reached a wide audience, the Black Dahlia had already been absorbed into American storytelling. She belonged to noir now, to crime fiction, to a tradition where dead women functioned as catalysts for male transformation. The murder was no longer just an unsolved case, it was narrative material. And Ellroy's success ensured that future writers would return to her again and again, drawn not only by the mystery, but by the mythology that had grown around it. He wasn't alone. By then, Elizabeth Short had already become something larger than herself, a character endlessly rewritten by men who believed they understood her, and by readers who could not look away. If pulp fiction turned Elizabeth Short into a literary archetype, film and television turned her into something even more powerful, an icon. The first major screen interpretation arrived in the 1970s, when the case was still close enough in time to feel dangerous, but distant enough to be safely dramatized. The television film, Who is the Black Dahlia, starring Lucy Arnaz, approached the story with the tone of a procedural mystery. It was restrained by modern standards, more interested in the investigation than the murder. Yet even here the shift had already begun. Elizabeth was no longer simply a victim of an unsolved crime. She was becoming a narrative device. The film asked viewers to speculate, to guess, to participate in solving the mystery, and in doing so, it quietly transformed her death into entertainment. That tension would only grow stronger as Hollywood's fascination with moral ambiguity deepened in the late 1970s and early 1980s. True Confessions, in 1981, written by Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunn, never claimed to be a Dahlia film outright, but the influence is unmistakable. Didion and Dunn were brilliant observers of American myth-making, and they understood that the Dahlia case represented something larger than a single murder. Their fictionalized version of the crime becomes a moral test for men, priests, policemen, brothers. struggling with corruption and compromise in post-war Los Angeles. The murdered woman exists primarily as an absence, around which male guilt and ambition revolve. It is elegant, intelligent filmmaking, but it reinforces a pattern that would repeat again and again. Elizabeth Short as catalyst, not character. By the time James Ellroy's novel reached the screen in 2006, the mythology was fully formed. Brian De Palma's The Black Dahlia, starring Josh Hartnett, Scarlett Johansson, Hilary Swank, and Aaron Eckhart, was perhaps the most visually lavish adaptation the story had ever received. Mia Kirshner's portrayal of Elizabeth remains one of the most sympathetic and human interpretations ever attempted. She plays her as fragile but hopeful, lonely but still capable of humor, a young woman trying to belong in a city that kept pushing her to the margins. And yet the films surrounding her cannot resist the pull of fetishization. De Palma, a director long fascinated with voyeurism and violence, frames Elizabeth through mirrors, screens, and camera lenses. The lighting softens her. The editing aestheticizes her wounds. The audience is invited to mourn her, but also to admire the tragedy. The camera lingers just long enough to remind us that beauty and violence are being sold together. The film becomes a mirror of our own fascination. We ache for her, but we also consume the ache. And that contradiction is central to nearly every Dahlia adaptation that followed. Television pushed that contradiction even further. American Horror Story, that magpie collection of American terror tropes, inserted Elizabeth Short into its first season, in 2011, as a ghost trapped in perpetual reenactment. She appears as a spectral figure, doomed to relive her murder, reduced to an aesthetic: pale skin, dark hair, red lips, eternal victimhood. The show is knowingly grotesque, intentionally excessive, but its use of the Dahlia reveals something unsettling about modern horror. The real crime becomes interchangeable with fiction. The historical woman dissolves into genre. Then came I Am the Night in 2019, inspired by the true story of Fauna Hodel, the granddaughter of the elusive Dr. George Hodel, raised to believe she was a biracial child in an effort to protect her from her own disturbing legacy. I Am the Night, however, is deeply influenced by the theories advanced by George Hodel's son, Steve, in his books claiming his father killed Elizabeth Short. The series is gripping, beautifully shot, and undeniably atmospheric. Filming at the real Soden House, the Mayan revival mansion long associated with Hodel, sends a chill down the spine. The architecture alone feels like evidence, as though the building itself remembers something terrible. And yet, the foundation of the story rests on claims that cannot be substantiated. The series succeeds as drama precisely because it embraces the lurid possibilities of the theory. It is compelling television. It feels true even when it likely isn't. That tension raises an uncomfortable question. Can a fictional depiction be emotionally honest while historically wrong? The answer in this case is yes, and that may be part of the problem. The better the fiction becomes, the easier it is for audiences to confuse atmosphere with evidence. Across all of these depictions, the pattern repeats. Elizabeth appears in fragments, flashbacks, photographs, imagined conversations. She is rarely allowed to exist in the present tense. Cinema resurrects her only to return her to death. Again and again, the story promises to give her voice, and again it speaks over her. Hollywood cannot seem to stop reenacting the crime. Part of the reason is obvious. The Black Dahlia case is cinematic perfection. Beauty, mystery, sex, violence, and an ending that never resolves. An unsolved murder allows endless reinterpretation. Every generation can reshape her to reflect its own anxieties. Post-war corruption, sexual liberation, urban decay, celebrity obsession. Elizabeth Short becomes whatever the era needs her to be. But the real woman never had the chance to become any of those things. Her friends described someone kind, self-conscious, hopeful, a young woman who loved music and movies, who dreamed bigger than her circumstances allowed, someone who exaggerated her stories because she wanted to seem more worldly than she felt. That person rarely appears on screen. The industry prefers the symbol to the human being. Even art house treatments have struggled with this. Filmmakers drawn to Hollywood's darker mythology, from Kenneth Anger's elegiac explorations of fame and decay to countless student films shot in grainy black and white, have used the Dahlia as shorthand for lost innocence. The image carries instant meaning, no explanation required, but meaning comes at a cost. There is an unspoken law in Hollywood. The dead don't get residuals. Elizabeth Short has been paying that debt for nearly 80 years. Every adaptation claims to honor her. Every adaptation reshapes her to fit a narrative that was never hers. And somewhere beneath the lighting, the music, and the performances, the real woman remains absent, missing from her own story. That absence may be the most enduring legacy of the Black Dahlia on film. Not that she was forgotten, but that she was remembered incorrectly. There is a moment when fascination becomes consumption. That moment arrived for Elizabeth Short long after her body was laid out in a Los Angeles morgue, when the press photos went from evidence to iconography, when the black hair, the pale skin, the smile carved too wide became aesthetic. That's when the Black Dahlia stopped being a mystery and became a brand. In the decades since, her image has migrated from newspaper archives to t-shirts, tattoos, perfume bottles, horror conventions, even lingerie lines. Her face, stylized and symmetrical, appears on posters and pins like a noir Virgin Mary, venerated through violence. There's even a death metal band named the Black Dahlia Murder, a name meant to shock to sound dangerous and darkly glamorous. The band insists the reference is only metaphorical, but that metaphor is built on her body. Every fan in a concert crowd wearing her name is cheering for the poetry of a woman's mutilation. Across art galleries and Instagram feeds, Elizabeth Short has been remade as muse and martyr of aestheticized brutality. Pain became pop, and pop has no conscience. The fetishization began early. In the 1950s, men's magazines and pulp rags, True Detective, Police Gazette, Whisper, ran special features on the Black Dahlia, pairing posed crime scene recreations with lingerie models who bore a passing resemblance to her. The girl who died too beautiful, one headline read. It wasn't journalism. It was necrophilia disguised as storytelling. The camera, once meant to record truth, became a co-conspirator. Photographers recreated her pose, lighted her skin to marble sheen, and printed it for mass consumption. Hollywood noir posters borrowed her silhouette. Playwrights turned her into a metaphor for fallen femininity. Painters rendered her bisected form in shades of desire. Every frame said the same thing. Her suffering is your fantasy. The erotic undertone is impossible to miss. You can trace it through the decades, from shock-illustrated pinups to 1990s fetish photography to Tumblr pages where fans share stylized Black Dahlia makeup tutorials with red lipstick slashed to the cheekbones. It's a cult of aestheticized cruelty. Some followers call it dark glamour. But glamour, the word itself, means spell. To glamorize something is to enchant it. And our enchantment with the Black Dahlia has always been a kind of hex, one cast upon ourselves to feel something dangerous without consequence. There's a particular discomfort in realizing that violence against women sells. But that's exactly what the Dahlia myth has proven, decade after decade. The prettier the victim, the better the story. Every generation finds its own way to profit from her pain. True crime podcasts recite her autopsy report in tones of fascination. TikTok creators apply makeup to mimic her look, sometimes with the Glasgow smile, sometimes without. Etsy sellers make Dahlia candles and murder mystery coasters. Designers craft corsets inspired by Hollywood's most infamous corpse. We have turned Elizabeth Short into a cottage industry. And perhaps what's most tragic is how normalized it has become. A new generation knows her not as a person, not even as a case, but as an aesthetic. Black and white glamour, smeared red lips, vintage curls, and a whisper of death. We keep resurrecting her, but never to live, only to die again and again and again. It's collective participation in symbolic violence. The repetition of the act, over and over, disguised as homage, fascination, art. Some artists argue they are keeping her alive, that they are reclaiming the narrative. But to reclaim a thing, you must first acknowledge its ownership. No one alive today owns Elizabeth Short's story. Not the LAPD, not the tabloids, not Elroy, not De Palma, and not the endless chorus of us who've borrowed her likeness to probe the darkness in ourselves. There's a quiet rebellion in saying her real name without calling her the Black Dahlia. It's like opening a window in a smoke-filled room. You start to see the outline of a woman again, not the myth, not the mannequin, not the cinematic corpse, but a person, Elizabeth. She wasn't the first to be devoured by culture, but she might be the prototype for how fame and death fused in the American imagination. Before Marilyn, before Sharon, before Princess Diana, before Nicole or Jean Benet, before every true crime thumbnail, there was Elizabeth Short, the girl who became content. And the question remains, is there any ethical way to tell her story now? Writers, filmmakers, even historians wrestle with that. To ignore her is erasure. To exploit her is desecration. Between those poles lies a narrow space where empathy lives, the act of telling not to titillate, but to understand. Reclaiming Elizabeth means imagining her not in death, but in motion, standing in line for a movie at the Egyptian theater, laughing too loud at a cafe on Hollywood Boulevard, slipping a love letter into a mailbox. It means remembering that she dreamed, that she desired, that she was 22. The modern true crime industry promises closure, a seductive lie. What it delivers instead is an endless loop of retelling, a ritual reenactment of trauma for entertainment. And yet maybe the only way to break that loop is to keep looking, not at the body, but at the world that created it. When we say her name now, we should mean to summon truth, not spectacle. To speak for the silenced, not to silence again. Maybe we can't unmake the myth, but we can refuse to feed it. That, perhaps, is the only justice left. Reclaiming Elizabeth Short doesn't mean forgetting what happened to her. It means remembering that what happened wasn't inevitable. It was made possible by the way we look, the way we consume, the way we crave beauty and suffering. To change the story, we have to change the audience. Elizabeth Short didn't know she was becoming a true crime story. She was just trying to make it through another night in Los Angeles, another conversation, another chance that things might finally turn in her favor. The mythology came later, the headlines, the photographs, the endless retellings that transformed a young woman into a terrifying image and then into a brand. And every time we return to the Black Dahlia story, we have to ask ourselves what we are really looking for: truth or fascination, understanding or spectacle. Because the mystery was never hers to carry alone. The symbolism, the obsession, the projections, those belonged to us, to the culture that kept repeating her death long after her life was forgotten. Maybe the truest act of seeing her now is not to look closer, but to look differently, to step back from the violence and remember the ordinary human being at the center of it all. Elizabeth Short's afterlife has lasted longer than her 22 years. She's been filmed, fetishized, fictionalized, but rarely seen. Maybe the truest act of seeing her now is to stop staring, to turn away from the bisected image and remember the whole woman. To understand that the Black Dahlia was never the point. She was the product. And if we can say her name, Elizabeth, with the reverence owed to any human being, then maybe the spell finally breaks. In our final episode, The Reclamation of Elizabeth Short, we bring her home, to her mother, to her sisters, to herself. We give her the honor of her real story and the chance at the final word. Thank you for listening to The Eternal Life of the Black Dahlia. Every time we speak her real name, we return a fragment of humanity to a woman the world remembers only for the way she was murdered. This is H. Allegra Lansing. Until next time, may we remember Elizabeth Short, not for how she was found, but for how she lived, and how deeply she longed to be seen. This series is based on historical records, contemporary reporting, and archival research. All writing and narration by yours truly. Theme music is Black Screen by Ketsa, link in the show notes.